Media Anthropology and the Digital Challenge by Mark Allen Peterson. Text to video by Dr. Sajjad Haider, Anthropologist. From pictographs on clay tablets to acoustical structures designed to aid speaking, to newspapers, film and television, to social media, humans have developed a vast array of mediational spaces, artifacts, and practices that use technology to fix, extend, and elaborate on human communication. In every era and within every community, these tools and the practices associated with them entered into every aspect of human life and transformed those lives. Each new technology for symbolic communication led to new social institutions and new ways of sharing cultural models of social and cosmological orders. Media, therefore, are fundamental elements in human life and a necessary subject for anthropological inquiry. The anthropology of media emerged in a particular historical moment and developed theories and methods primarily to study a range of physical and electronic media technologies, such as the printing press, phonographs, and broadcast communications. As a result, early work in the anthropology of media tended to be focused on the creation, circulation, and consumption of fixed texts in an environment of radial media. The emergence of social media, web-based media, and digital gaming has created a variety of fascinating challenges for media anthropologists, as texts give way to new semiotic practices and processes involving intertextualization, collective narrative construction, spreadability, and decentered agency that requires new ways of conceiving media practices. At the same time, ethnographic methods, comparative approaches, and holistic perspectives continue to offer promising ways forward for the anthropology of media. Functionalist Foundations. Serious anthropological interest in media arose in the 1930s with the emergence of ethnographic studies of contemporary U.S. cities, such as Robert and Helen Lynn's Middletown Studies and William Lloyd Warner's Yankee City Project. The Lynns focused on how print media, and later radio, introduced new ideas into Middletown, a pseudonym for Muncie, Indiana, and how these ideas were incorporated into local social formations or led to social change. In his decades-long study of a New England town, Warner initially saw media as serving informational functions, but later came to view media as primarily symbolic and expressive of dominant local cultural norms and values. Although important and influential at the time they were produced, these works introduced an unfortunate tendency into ethnography. While print, film, and electronic media were included in most studies of Western European and North American societies, they were largely ignored among non-Western societies. Written within the structural functionalist paradigm that dominated social theory at the time, most early works by anthropologists on media were concerned with how media enabled and constrained the flow of information within a social structure, how media content expressed and shaped cultural norms and values, and how people incorporated ideas and practices from media into their lives. Social structures were seen as essentially coherent and stable, and the primary function of media was to integrate people successfully into that structure. Perhaps the most widely read of these early works was Hortense Powdermaker's Hollywood: The Dream Factory, 1950, a substantive anthropological study of the U.S. film industry. Over time, these studies also became interested in changing media mobilities, such as the emergence of portable radios, and the ways media content broadcast into the community from outside changed people's awareness of the world outside the civic community. These interests coincided with critiques of the functionalist insistence on circumscribing communities as integrated aggregates of social institutions whose interconnections created a complete and bounded whole. Amidst a growing awareness of urbanization and modernization trends globally, anthropologists began asking what roles media played in facilitating social change. Modernization studies, which sought to describe and explain the cultural relationships and potential for innovation created by movements of people between cities and traditional villages, became an increasingly interesting project of study. In a series of influential works, Robert Redfield and Milton Singer proposed an urban folk continuum, arguing that urban intellectuals, including media professionals but also religious leaders, political propagandists, educators and many others, drew on folk symbols, which were appropriated, rationalized and incorporated into great traditions, cultural discourses at a national level. In turn, new ideas, cosmologies and social practices from these national cultures made their way back into local communities and were incorporated into everyday life. In this model, local communities served as sources of authenticity, creativity, and innovation, while urban centers served to fuse local traditions into a shared civilizational culture that could serve as a basis for national identity without seeming too alien. National culture. The Second World War disrupted most ongoing anthropological research in the U.S. and cut ethnographers from their filled areas. Drawing on the Boasian notion that cultures could be conceptualized as coherently patterned and bounded units, a large school of anthropologists emerged which sought to analyze culture at a distance. The primary method was to understand mass media texts as expressive of the national cultures that produced them, in the same ways that rituals, art, folktales, and mythologies were studied by anthropologists as expressive of the cultures of smaller-scale societies. A core theoretical assumption was that culture could be treated as the personality of the society, and personality as the culture of the individual, Sapir 1985a. The primary technique was to read novels, newspapers and essays, view movies, listen to music and radio, and then to discuss these with informants from the communities under study, variously constituted by refugees, immigrants, or even first or second-generation descendants of immigrants living in the US or UK. Anthropologists often work together in small groups, meeting and discussing interviews and the ongoing research. They labeled their technique cultural analysis, seeing it as analogous to the psychoanalysis of individuals. The goal was to elicit high-order themes, propositions about what constitutes moral behavior or the goals of human existence, and which recur in multiple cultural expressions across a range of materials, and which could be clustered to offer broad assessments of national cultures. One of the most sophisticated studies was Bateson's analysis of the Film Hitler Junge Quecks, 1932. In which he examines how Nazi filmmakers used psychologically relevant symbols from German national culture to influence German audiences in order to create Nazis. Development communications. During the Cold War between the US and USSR, US anthropologists were often enlisted in efforts to develop non-Western societies. Many development theories were rooted in a teleological model of social evolution that assumed all societies passed through a series of stages from primitive, indicated by kin-based social organization and dominated by non-market systems of exchange, to advanced, marked by industrialization and market economies. Traditional cultures become, in this model, impediments to advancement. Development theorists advocated using print, radio, FM, television, and other media to promote new values and norms that would assist societies in adapting to industrialization, wage labor, market exchange, commodification, bureaucratic systems of government, and other forms of modernity. Anthropologists were often employed not only to develop culturally appropriate forms of symbolic content for such media, but also to assist in creating culturally appropriate modes of media communication. For example, should men and women watch films together? Were separate screenings necessary for different age sets? Modernization theories had introduced the notion that media played a significant role in fusing authentic local traditions with innovation to make modernization palatable. This served as one of several theoretical bases for the creation of development communication. Anthropologists were recruited to assist in creating soap operas in which pro-development messages were embodied in sympathetic characters, while supposedly backward-looking characteristics were embodied in unsympathetic characters. Others helped encode development messages into popular genres of media, such as family planning music videos in Mexico. Ultimately, efforts to harness media as a magic bullet to transform societies failed to yield the kinds of results development projects sought. In addition, most development theories of the time came under severe criticism by anthropologists, as did the linear transmission model of media they utilized. Media as symbolic systems. In the 1960s, media anthropology began to increasingly focus on media content as forms of expressive culture in industrialized, technological societies. It was strongly influenced by the structural anthropology of Claude Lévi-Strauss and the symbolic and interpretive anthropological approaches advanced by Mary Douglas, Victor and Edith Turner, and Clifford Geertz. Anthropologists primarily focused on how cultural messages, especially value systems, moral codes, and cosmological orders, were encoded in media. One unfortunate peculiarity of this movement was a tendency by anthropologists to focus on the media of their own societies. Susan Bean, a renowned Tamil linguist, analyzed American soap operas rather than exploring the large and vibrant Tamil media industry. Ivan Karp, an expert on African ideological systems, wrote on the Marx Brothers. John L. Caughey, a specialist on the truck, studied how Americans interact with media figures in their imaginations, 1984. South Asianist Peter Claus offered a structural analysis of Star Trek, 1982. Non-Western scholars followed a similar pattern. Pakistan-born anthropologist Akbar Ahmed wrote about press coverage of a religious mass suicide in Pakistan, 1986, and about Indian films, 1991. Indian anthropologist Veena Das examined the structure of kinship in Pakistani romance novels, 1973, and Indian anthropologist T.N. Madan examined Hindi, Kannada, Marathi and Tamil novels to explore Hindu concepts of morality and suffering, 1987. Exceptions include William O. Beeman on Iranian media, 1982, Susan Rogers on Indonesian cassette culture, 1986, and Conrad Kodak on Brazilian television, 1990. An additional trend explored encounters and intersections between Western media and local non-Western practices. Interpretive and symbolic approaches to media received a significant boost with the advent of the field of cultural studies in the UK during the 1970s, which added an important focus on power. Cultural studies dealt with such traditional anthropological foci as class structures, national formations, race, and gender, but asked how popular media might express, reinforce, or contest ideologies that support inequalities within these social forms. Cultural studies drew attention to the ways social forms and identities were represented in popular culture forms, primarily media texts, and asked how consuming such media created opportunities for media consumers to reinforce, negotiate, or resist their own identities and social formations. Anthropologists published nuanced readings of American FIMs in mainstream anthropology journals, and many anthropologists studying media found ideas in the cultural studies literature about polysemic readings of texts within the context of political economy far more useful than earlier forms of symbolic anthropology. Elizabeth Traub's Dreaming Identities, 1992, and Stephen Caton's Lawrence of Arabia, A Film's Anthropology, 1999, are notable examples. Although influenced by its attention to power and inequality, few media anthropologists fully embraced the cultural studies movement for a number of reasons. First, cultural studies primarily focused on analyzing social positions inscribed in texts, rather than ethnographically engaging with actual text consumers occupying those social positions. Second, although much of the theory in cultural studies was predicated on a critical stance toward capitalist culture industries, there was little interest in ethnographic research into actual practices of media production. Third, the strong emphasis in cultural studies on how media consumption is inflected by race, gender, and class produced what was for many anthropologists an ethnocentric bias toward North American and European cultural categories, giving little attention to categories like caste, religious community, language community, age set, or other identity distinctions that may be equally or more salient in non-Western settings. Work like Purnima Mankakar's Screening Culture, 1999, demonstrates the power of ethnographic engagement with text consumers within an approach influenced by cultural studies, while Barry Dornfeld's Producing Public Television, Producing Public Culture, 1998, and William Mazzarella's Shoveling Smoke, 2003, demonstrate the necessity of more nuanced approaches to cultural production, both in North America and elsewhere in the world.